All right, hello everyone. I'm trying something new today, and I'm responding to comments on a video blog that I recorded with the title "Decentering and Specialization." And this, I had been shifting away from recording video blogs on stuff like this, instead trying to just write a Substack for a while. But it looks like this particular video blog, I mean, it's like I only got 7 likes on it. So, but compared to what I've been doing on this modest little YouTube channel, this getting over 100 views and 7 likes is a success as far as this modest channel has been, right? I have to also admit that I have other YouTube projects that I may upload on more regularly, but in light of this, I also got more feedback and more comments than usual. And so I thought I would take the chance here to respond to I don't usually do this. So I'm trying to experiment with some different ways to approach doing stuff on YouTube. And so with this in mind, I will respond to these comments. First of all, I'm going to read both of them out, and then because there's a certain pattern that I find with both of them. Okay, so the first comment comes from Daniel Lakehurst, and he says, "I think by the end I understood the position you are taking, or thereabouts, and I think I agree with you. I'd enjoy having a conversation with you, I'm sure. If you'd like, I would be able to give you some of my thoughts on the structure of your monologue. I think you have some really valuable things to say. I just think if you tweaked a few things, it would become more accessible. Much love. Hope you are having a good day." All right. Well, thank you. And I don't know. I have to admit that I've seemed to fall into a pattern of being somewhat asocial, or at least it could be that a lot of the people that I am in contact with are just very busy. And so if somebody wants to I haven't been talking to people online that much, but if you are on, I don't know, what's your favorite like messaging platform? If you use Discord or something like that, or if there's something like you can, maybe I might be up for chatting, right? But anyways, to continue on, I'm just going to read the other one first before I get more into the details of what my response is to all this stuff. The next person to respond is Lee Korak, who says, "You spent so much time explaining all the different points of views of the matter that I got lost on what is your point of view and the point that you're trying to get across. I think that explaining other points of views is great for a nuanced video, but the lack of editing or something to separate the contextualization of the discussion and the conclusion difficults my engagement with that, with what you're trying to bring, difficults my engagement with what you're trying to bring to the table. Makes more difficult." Okay. "I'd like to spend this time with you nonetheless. You are an interesting mind. I hope my comment gives you a useful insight somehow." Now, the thing about this is that there's some pattern. Well, I mean, I guess it's relevant to the topic that I was trying to approach, right? The topic that I was trying to approach was the topic of decentralization and also specialization, which has a lot to do with the idea of having a pluralist, multicultural, or a sort of social fragmentation in society, and that this being having to do with the decentralization of the because part of this whole thing is that obviously I'm a white guy, I'm a male, and there's something about the idea of the majoritarianism of this patriarchal white hetero normativity kind of thing, right? That goes with all this identity politics. Now, the thing about this is that, so there's the whole thing about identity politics is that the position should be, if you're taking it at this most basic of a level, the position should be fairly immediate and obvious, right? That in this whole system, my position is that as a white guy, as insofar as that I identify as a heteronormative gender, cisgender white dude in and I'm also Canadian, right? So I live in a colonial, I live in a country, I live in the place where I live prior to the house that I live in being built here was basically nobody lived here, right? And then there were native communities that were settled in various areas, but it's basically like taking an area and basically just bulldozing everything, whatever was here before, in this completely neutral space in which you set up the subject of white settler colonialism, of which me being a white male heteronormative guy, I am by default, apparently the world has to cater to my subjectivity, right? So like this is kind of the problem, is that if you within that situation, but this is obviously, I don't really feel like playing it from, well, hold on, what am I trying to say? Why am I making, why did I start making a YouTube channel? Why am I writing a Substack? Because part of the reason I have a certain impulse to write or to create things or whatever is that based on this identity system, it's supposed to be like, this whole situation is supposed to reinforce that kind of subjectivity, basically. And then if you are, when you're the decentering of it is basically to experience, there's this kind of idea that like, if you think about like a movie, like let's say like the stuff that was popular in the 80s, like Sylvester Stallone movies, like Rocky or Rambo or something like that. Like there's a certain kind of glamour in like having big muscles, in like, or like shooting guns, or like being a boxer who's like the champion boxer, and that there's a certain kind of like, the whole structure is, if you're not getting good numbers on YouTube, you're like a loser, and you're just wallowing in like shame and humiliation of not being able to have a good YouTube channel. But then if you are able to have a whole team behind you of people like video editors or coaches or all this kind of stuff, it's like to train you like Rocky to be like the guy who rises to the top, to be like the champion or whatever, right? And the thing about, so like, this is the whole thing, is that the whole thing about decentering is that we're going to allocate those resources to other people so that they can be the champion, the winner of that game. And that rather than me being some white guy who's just on default, like of default privilege, thinks that I have to be in that position, instead I get to step out from playing the pressure to play that game and do something different, right? And basically the whole point now is that there's a certain kind of like totalitarian attitude that says that whatever occupies the center position of whatever is rising to the top and being the most popular, the most dominant, is, or even the most accessible, is basically the standard by which we all have to adjust ourselves to, because this is what we are selecting and saying yes to, right? And in this, we're not questioning the actual structure that we're stepping into that brings us to the spotlight, that puts us on center stage. Instead, what we're doing is we're just saying that we're going to put other people in that position, and that we're going to deprioritize the white male patriarch thing, right? So the whole point is like, within this topic, there's a question of like point of view and perspective, and it's like it comes up in both of these comments, right? What is your position? We're talking about this whole situation where there's like the idea of a kind of this totalitarian system that was built off a white male patriarchy, and then what is my position within that system? Or what is my perspective on that system? And it's like the fact that I don't get to choose that I'm white, I don't get to choose that I'm, well, I mean, if I decided to go trans or something, that would be a way to opt out of the gender binary, right? Or if I was, you don't choose your identity, right? The system codes this identity on you, and then either punishes you for not conforming to that identity, or gives you gratifying stuff for conforming to that. You're like, oh, good job, you're doing what we want you to do as a white male heteronormative patriarch. And then you have all these people to reinforce that for you, or else people to say that you're not doing what we want you to, right? And so there's this okay, in this thing you've got the perspectives, positions, and accessibility. And for me, when you also get into this whole thing about making things accessible, there's a certain relevance to the problem of making things accessible when it comes to disability. And I have intentionally, up until this point of answering this reply, played it from the position of basic identity politics without disclosing anything about a disability, right? So there's some kind of thing where, based on just being like if the disability creates an obstacle to rising up in like whatever success or popularity or being able to make a business, there's a social model of disability that says that the only thing that makes that disability happen is if the structure is made to be inaccessible, right? It's not, it's only accessible to people who think a certain way, or have a certain kind of perception, or a certain level of sensitivity or whatever, or only accessible to people who conform to a kind of standard, right? And I think it's important within the context to understand why this whole principle of accessibility has become so important to us in the first place. And basically the origins of accessibility and disability rights and all this kind of stuff came from the veterans movement, where you had people who had lost their limbs and were bound to wheelchairs and stuff like that due to fighting in the wars, who then, when they had elections, were unable to vote because the places where they were voting didn't have wheelchair access, right? And of course there's other things like mail-in voting and all this kind of stuff, but essentially you have to look at where this started. And the importance of accessibility, first of all, started in this contextual situation where you had war, you had veterans, you had people that were drafted without their will into the war to go fight, and supposedly for the principle to protect the democracy, the protection of a free democratic society. And then the sort of hypocrisy that the people that are on the line to protect that then were not able to vote because they were devalued by that system. Because this is the point of this centralizing or decentralizing, is that the center is not just a white male patriarch. The central thing is to be in a fully ambulatory, full state of health and ability, right? So you're like, the center is being perfectly able, right? So basically, it's like if you are making media, it assumes that the subject is either in a state of perfect health and well-being, or if they are veering away from that, you have to do everything you can do to be like, how do we help this person correct their bad habits, to optimize them so that they're always in an optimum state of health and well-being, so that they're not like the veterans who's lost their legs, who need us to build a wheelchair ramp and then guilt trip us for the hypocrisy of the people that are supposed to defend democracy being the first people that are omitted from that process, right? And in that context, there's an obvious kind of relevance. But if you put it now in this situation where American democracy is obviously having some really major problems, first of all, right? And even when it comes to like accessibility around voting, when it comes to like things like mail-in ballots, or when it comes to voting machines, or when it comes to and then or Doge, it's important to remember that one of the things about this whole Doge thing was that it's about accessibility. It's not just about racial inclusion. It's about disability accessibility. And there's something about all of this in that when I'm making my content, I there's this question about when people are asking me what my position is on all of this, is that if I have a disability, is it just can you infer that I have a disability by the way that I talk, or how I communicate, um, or is it just readily apparent that I have a disability? Or is having a disability something that I have to disclose and that I have to name and I have to put out there? And then if my disability is something that can be weaponized against me to discriminate against me or judge me as a sort of one of these people that does not deserve, like a eugenicist would be like, oh, this is a disabled person who we have to, sterilize or something like this because he's got bad genes and we don't, what I'm trying to say is that you are asking me to identify my position in a system where the whole reason why accessibility is an important thing to consider in the first place is in the context of people being drafted into war and then being denied the right to vote because they're disabled. And we have a regime right now which is aggressively, the thing is, I have to also I'm in the position of a Canadian. So right now, the whole conversation about all that is one step removed. Like, thank God I live in Canada, and like I'm under all this constant threat of Canada being made into the 51st state, so we get just as bad treatment as the Americans, right? And basically, my position is of a Canadian who has a certain degree of privilege from care from the social healthcare system, and all this kind of stuff, and facing the I don't know, is it even in my best maybe what if it's just better for me to keep my mouth shut, or is it better for me to have a voice to speak for myself? And most often the people that do have a disability or feel like they are dependent on the system or whatever, they're made to feel really ashamed about this, and so that they're basically programmed so that they don't have a voice, right? And so there's this kind of in that position, there's this is my position where I'm starting from, basically. And I used to be more upfront about this, it's I'm kind of playing coy in a way, because obviously you could probably just go to some of my other videos on this channel and listen to I've been fairly open about the fact that I have a mental health disability, or that I was at one point in time I was active with Anti-Psychiatry, and in that situation the position of anti-psychiatry or critical psychiatry or whatever or the MAD movement, the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, is that most of what was going on there had to do with a certain form of grievance politics. And in that, I have to admit that I met a lot of other people who had major grievances with the psych system, with the mental health system, all that kind of stuff. And comparing my story to them, I had experienced a couple of forced hospitalizations after a kind of a breakdown that happened when I was in my early 20s. But there were a lot of people that I met that had introduced to the psychiatric system more like when they were children or something like that, and had a long, being medicated for things like childhood ADHD or stuff like this, and or autism. I don't know if autistic kids get medicated as much though, right? But there's all of these people that have a different experience than me, and compared with my experience, I found it was easier to just get my ass out of there and count my lucky stars that my grievances weren't as bad as some of these other grievances. Some people are suing the mental health system for electroshock therapy, or a very horrific form of treatment, especially if it's something that you're not consenting to. When that movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and all this, right? There's all of this because basically in my experience of dealing with other people in that scene, I kind of feel like my position is that I agree with them, but it's not really my place to make a big deal out of making a grievance with the psychiatric system, because if anything, I think who am I to judge? Maybe I don't know. There is some basic thing about where I have grievances with the fact that the medical system seems to work in such a way where they get you on a pharmaceutical drug, and regardless of whether you need it or not or whatever. There's apparently informed consent, but there's this kind of tendency where you're just like, they want to just keep you dependent on this drug for the rest of your life, and then say that they know better and that and all this. And so there's this whole kind of thing, and was very invested in that for a long period of time. And there's something about it where, aside from that whole situation, like, I'm just a white male dude, right? Like and if unless the way I communicate or the way I think or the way I want to create media comes across as being very disorderly or chaotic or mad or crazy or something like that, there's like, aside from that, people probably wouldn't not be able to tell that I was disabled. And so basically I just occupy the sort of, like, you, based on the way that you look and what your body is like and all this kind of stuff, you just occupy by default this sort of like the default subjectivity of being like a heteronormative white guy. And then you're constantly aware of like all this pressure that, like, if you do anything that might be considered queer or not conforming to like these preconceived standards, you're going to be policed by people, basically, right? And there's something about this where you're constantly just put in this box, and then you're like, well, actually, I have all this other stuff about how I'm like disabled or but nobody wants to hear about that, right? Nobody wants to hear about that at all. Like, or they basically, especially because it's like in the whole, if you consider, okay, the problem of like identity politics and intersectionality is what I've noticed is that there's a whole conversation around how the rates of psychosis are higher for people who are new immigrants or refugees or something like that. And now what's kind of funny is that if you look at what's happening with ICE and you look at what's happening in America, where you have this, people were basically going psychotic because there's this thing that is now people are just acting it out, right? Like, now the psychosis is just like this full-fledged thing that's happening in Washington, D.C. It's not like there's something that's in some crazy person's head. It's like we're actually going to have all these crazy, like, militarized cops going around and rounding people up, right? You have to understand that we're having this conversation in that context, and based on factors that are not under my control. I don't remember before being born having the character selection screen. You know, people don't have a choice on what person that they're born into this life to play as, and that, so I'm stuck in the system where I'm aware that there are these oppressive forces that are imbalanced, so other people get more of the brunt of that stuff. And so in all this, it's like there's this intersectional conversation around radical mental health and feminism or racism and stuff like that, and how, you know, it's obvious because, you know, it's like it's like, how many times have you been on the public transit and there's some guy who is obviously visibly having a mental health problem, and he looks like he's like a Mexican or you know, like, or he's just like paranoid that everybody is judging him or everybody is seeing him as some kind of enemy, and he's skitzing out and he's just like, like, and it's like, as a white guy, there's something about it where it's like whatever it is that makes you crazy is not going to be the same as if you're the immigrant who's worried about everybody is like judging him as like, oh, you're just some migrant workers who's going to steal everybody's jobs, or you're like a criminal or something, like a dangerous criminal who we need to lock away, right? Like, this is all stuff that was making people crazy before all the Americans decided to vote for these policies where you just act out your madness, right? Like, it was like the underlying madness, and now you're just acting it all out, right? So this is like, what my position is that I'm a Canadian, first of all. I'm not an American, and I don't really think we have anything to worry about. I think it's like, I think that the whole 51st state thing is, if anything, is like a psyop to try to aggravate me, to try to make me more crazy, right? But like, as is, Canada's economy is not so bad. We're negotiating better trade deals than the EU is right now. I don't think we're really in that bad of a position. So it's like, there's this whole industry around trying to make people more aggravated, more like, I just feel like I'm motivated to make this stuff because there's things that even if I've managed to sort of have develop a certain stability to balance out kind of thing, to not be at risk of like making this mental health, this, it feels like the mental health stuff for me is in the rear view, because I give myself some outlet to express myself. I don't, I can make sure I take care of my basic, health needs. I can get enough exercise, get enough sleep, try to eat healthy, do all this kind of stuff. You know what I'm trying to say? And to basically try to live a healthy lifestyle so that those things which make me a disabled person are not the most first and foremost thing that I have to like play an identity politics game about being disabled. Because what tends to happen about all this is that you are either using grievance politics, a grievance against the mental health system, suggesting you're mistreated or misdiagnosed or whatever, or else what you're doing is you are making an argument for accessibility, being like, I just need to, which there is an, I think, if you're talking about like maybe employment or something like that, if you want, if for people who want to create to improve rates of employment with people who have disabilities, like I used to work a job where I had coworker that had a disability where she was deaf, right? So in order she had to have a person that was there as a support worker that was with her during all her shifts, so that for people that needed to communicate with her who didn't know how to do sign language, she would have an interpreter that could sign and translate for her, that then filled in the gap, so that she was now because everybody has the right to work in a liberal society, basically, right? And so there's this whole kind of thing, there's this whole industry around taking if people have disabilities, and trying this whole industry of like all these jobs that can be created for people to fill in the gap of like why would a workplace environment not be accessible to given to a certain disability, right? Now, and this is it seems like I'm going on a rant here, but this is all basically implied in the comments that are going on. And with all this in mind, I'm making a certain stylistic choice not to make edits, right? And by clicking on Lee Korvac's link, this is a person who, hold on. If you do this, it says video editor and filmmaker. Contact me, korak@gmail.com. So if you can read between the lines, hold on. I've kind of messed. Now you can see what all my algorithm recommendations look like. So you spent so much time explaining all the different points of view on the matter that I got lost in what is your point of view and the point you're trying to get across. So basically, with all this in mind, what I've been talking about is at some point in time, when it comes to social media or creating content for social media or connecting with communities for social media, at some point in time, because I was just really not happy or frustrated with the whole mainstream conversation around mental health and disability, I had a phase of being active in the online community around spiritual emergency. And in that, I had certain people, when I was more active talking to people or getting to dialogues and discussions about things, there were certain people that I used to talk to quite a lot, and sometimes I'd entertain the idea of like, maybe if this picked up just a little bit more, then I could have like a podcast where I had some guy that I would talk to who had you didn't have to agree with everything, but like somebody you could talk to and bounce ideas and like have some entertaining discussion or something like that. Right? But then I ended up just getting into a fight with this guy and deleting him and never talking to him again, because I can't even remember what it was I was saying, but I had this criticism that in my, it was just me commenting on one of this guy's posts, but this guy was saying that I was missing the point of what he was trying to say. Right? And that or that something like people, you could say that you are, there's some kind of thing that I also would run into. I sometimes try to socialize with people, and maybe I guess it could be like a social disability, or like maybe this is my version of having Asperger's or autism, and I can't socialize. But I would try to communicate with people, but people would lose patience with me because they would not understand what the point is that I'm trying to get across, right? That there's like, so what is the point of this? What's the point? Like, as if there's this one thing, there's a point, right? There's a point that you're trying, what's the point of this? Right? Like, it's like, and so there's this kind of thing of like, or like if somebody communicates you to something, that there is an inherent meaning in what they are communicating, and that if you diverge from what that inherent meaning is, then you missed the point, and you trying to bring something else up is besides the point, right? That there's only one point that the person is making, and that if you are taking it in some other direction, they don't have any obligation to follow you in that other direction you're going. You know, and that you can. And so basically, it's all this pressure. Like the same way, what I'm trying to say is that you have a constant thing where if you stay in your lane, being a white patriarchal hetero white guy or whatever, right? And you're gonna have all this thing just reinforcing that you're doing the right thing, but then you're like, oh well, wait a minute, but have you ever thought about this? You know, I just had an idea that nobody else has thought of, like an original idea or a different take. People are like, but you're missing the point. The point is you're supposed to be this one person, this very specific thing that we always are telling you that you're supposed to be, right? Or maybe I'm exaggerating, right? But this is what it feels like. Or like that if you're going to do a video for YouTube, there's only one way to do it, which is you have to have everything edited a certain way, or you have to have making it as accessible as possible to people who have like hearing disabilities or something like that. So you have to, I don't even know, like, or like you have to, for people who so you have to have closed captioning on everything or something, right? Like it's like to make it accessible, right? Or that if you are have some sort of basically the whole premise of making a YouTube, you have a platform that you have this button that says create. You hit the button, you put a video in there, you upload it. There's certain rules, like this isn't a pornography site, right? You're not going to be doing anything too explicit. There's probably not going to be if you say anything that could really get you in trouble, they'll take it down. But you have this sort of room of freedom to create, a freedom to do what you want, right? And that if you're not doing it the way that people want you to do it, then people will try to like steer you back onto track or something like that, right? I don't know. I've also noticed there are now also plugins that you can get, or some sort of thing where you run your video through an AI thing that edits it for you. So it could be that there's another thing about, is it more ethical to hire an actual editor? I also have to say, I was doing therapy for a while, and my therapist was making the same comment, saying that I've got some good ideas, but I could use an editor, right? And that but the thing is, even this whole, I don't know about what an editor is going to be selecting for versus what they're not selecting for, and the whole premise of, if I was going to hire an editor, it's a red flag, the criticism of not understanding what the point is, or this idea where you have to make everything really accessible so it's just one point that's easy to understand, and that if you're not doing that, you know what I'm saying? The center is people who do things where there's an easy to understand, accessible point that you're communicating clearly and directly, and to be decentered is to be out in the margins doing who knows what, and people may not understand what it is, and they may misinterpret it, or they may get confused, or they may think you've lost the plot. They may think you don't get the point, right? So So out of all this, to continue maybe I'll just explain my perspective more clearly. Um, so I was saying I was in the spiritual emergence community for a while. At some point in time, maybe I had this idea to like start a podcast or to talk to people, but there's like this is kind of bringing up the problem of my conflict. The why I get into conflicts with people is they try to push this thing on me that I'm supposed to conform to a certain way of communicating or to conform to a very specific point that I'm trying to get across, and then they want to clarify what my position is, or if it's not just already apparent what my position is based on what I look like or how I communicate. They're trying to, like, if there's a belief or if there's an idea or if there's a ideology or there's a lineage maybe that I follow or something like that. And if you want to take it in that direction, basically what happened was that for a while, what I've started off, first of all, get into stuff like Alan Watts, working with a meditation teacher, and rather than trying to get into like philosophy or critical theory or anything like that, basically working more on like meditation as a way to sort of, like, I don't know, a lot of people actually don't think meditation is maybe the best for mental health, and that's a whole conversation in its own. But for me, it helped immensely. It really, I mean, it may be kind of even counterintuitive, right? Why? Because some people have spiritual emergency psychosis triggered by meditation and that style of working, but I had it prior to that, and then in the aftermath, I thought meditation helped immensely to sort of settle things out, right? And to sort of like get a lot more calm and still and whatever. The cheesy thing about it, there's a lot of stress though meditating, right? Sometimes meditating feels stressful and frustrating and all this kind of stuff. So it's not just like a shortcut to feeling all chilled out and groovy and at peace, right? So, but in all of this, so from Alan Watts and meditation, and when you combine that with the anti-psychiatry, radical mental health stuff, I was really to R.D. Laing for a while and all that. And then eventually I started doing, my other channel, I was doing astrology. I still do an astrology channel for those who don't know. And through doing astrology, I was introduced to the work of James Hillman, right? James Hillman was a post-Jungian analyst, a psychoanalyst that studied directly under Carl Jung. And I was just blown away by James Hillman when I first started reading him. I had this big chunk of time that probably lasted at least a few years where I was just reading shitloads of James Hillman, and I was just like, I still haven't finished reading all the James Hillman books I collected within that period of time. And then the thing is, James Hillman is really dense, like sometimes he's really like, or he's just like, he packs so much into his what he communicates. Right, and I'm really impressed by James Hillman, and so there's something about James Hillman's approach that informs this whole project of mine in one way or another. But there's a thing about, like, he's such a very specific character, or has a specific way of dealing with things, that if you're not already familiar with him, that could be just another topic on its own about trying to explain how James Hillman is relevant to all this. I think my James Hillman interest was kind of interrupted by meeting some people who were really into Deleuze and Guattari. I got invited to join a Deleuze and Guattari book club, and then there's this. At first, I found Deleuze and Guattari kind of inaccessible, you could say, hard to approach. Some people do say that Anti-Oedipus is a incredibly difficult work. So I was nonetheless kind of curious. Actually, I ended up noticing that even James Hillman, at some point in his lectures, talks about Felix Guattari. So Hillman was hip to all this stuff, and there's more in common with James Hillman and Deleuze and Guattari than you might expect, based on if you just however you categorize them, right? And I think that this is basically the problem with being asked what your position is, because it's like, is the question of being asked your position, like, what ideology or what in all of this, basically, what I noticed was that there's a common kind of commonality between Hillman and Deleuze and Guattari that emphasized a pluralistic approach, right? And this is relevant to the original topic of decentering, right? That the whole point here is that what's kind of interesting about this is that if you look at, so often people talk about Western culture as if it's just this one homogenous thing that you trace all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome or something like that. And you've got the Western canon, right? Or you've got the and part of this whole thing is that you had people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who started as a regardless of him being famous for his own contribution to philosophy and literature, Nietzsche was a classical professor where he studied the Greek tragedies. That's why his first book was The Birth of Tragedy, right? So there's this kind of thing where Nietzsche, right? There's this kind of there's in the Renaissance, in the sort of movement of the Western Enlightenment, there was the Renaissance was going back to ancient Greece, partly because up until that point nobody knew about Plato, right? They only had Aristotle, and nobody had access to Plato. So there's this return to Greece, right? This is what Hillman's all about, is the return to Greece. Now, the problem about this also is that the Greeks were very warlike, right? And but the funny thing about this is that if you look in the popular iconography about this kind of idea of a Western civilization and the return to Greece, if you go, like, I remember I was shopping for t-shirts and I found this t-shirt that was like, for Sparta stuff or whatever. Eventually, I decided to like get rid of this because it seemed a bit fascistic, though, right? The thing about the Spartans is that the Spartans had maybe a very different ethos than let's say the Epicureans, who might be considered to be like the polar opposite of the Spartans, right? The Epicureans were all about having a kind of a sensitive appreciation for art and beauty, or even just the simple grounded pleasures of daily life, like enjoying a good meal or something like that, right? The Spartans, in contrast, were a society where everyone had to be a warrior, right? Now, if everybody has to be a warrior, being sensitive and appreciating things like, art and good cooking and stuff like that is not valued by a warrior society, right? But when we talk about this thing about a return to Greece, there's people do this thing where they think about like Western civilization as if it's just one line of conquest and domination with all these people like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and all of going all the way back into ancient history, and that we just have the continuation of this one imperial force, right? And then you miss the fact that you have the Epicureans, right? Or you have in the exchange between different cultures, like the Egyptians, right? The Hellenistic era was a multicultural society where there was a cross-cultural exchange going on, and the whole point of the return so this is what you bring in with the whole point of position and perspective, is that the whole story of where we come from, what our position is actually comes from a history that is itself a kind of a tapestry of plurality, right? And we have this sort of, the way that we think about all this thing is that we've been conditioned to think that a multiplicity of perspectives is chaotic and frustrating and difficult and just too complicated, and we want everything to be simple and just to have a straightforward point, and just to be like, so if we identify you are a straight white male and you have to do this and act like this, and then if otherwise you have to specify what your identity is, what your position, tell us what your disability is, tell us what you need to make the workplace accessible for you, all this. And so we just create this, you know what I'm trying to say? That if you're not doing that, you're way out from the fucking margins somewhere, right? So there's this kind of thing where on one hand, you see where I'm going with this? The whole thing is like but it creates this weird society where if you start talking about ancient Greece or something like that, it gets coded in a certain way. You've got like the Roman gladiators or the Spartans, and you forget about the Epicureans, or you forget about all the other people that may these whole plurality of forces of things that are all mixed in there, right? And like the idea of like, so there's any effort to like point out something that doesn't conform with this weird narrow machine view of the world just has to get edited out, basically, right? And so the editor is just like, that doesn't, it doesn't cater to this story, or we need to identify a demographic who we want to market ourselves to, and the demographic is always going to be a bunch of tough Spartan dudes, not the fucking Epicureans, right? So like there's this kind of like, even before I was even really that well educated, there's something about like when I first moved out from my parents' house, I had things like Epicurean ideas informing my attitude towards life. Like maybe rather than being very Spartan about or austere about things, maybe it's better to enjoy life. Maybe it's better to appreciate, if you're living in the city, what are the good restaurants around? Like where it's like an opportunity to enjoy. Like you don't have to live in this sort of like judging the world as evil, or the pleasures of the world as something that make you sinful and guilty, but you can enjoy food, you can enjoy music, you can enjoy sex, you can enjoy all sorts of things. And then whereas the Spartan has to like take all these things as indulgences that make people weak, lazy soldiers, and our vulnerabilities to attack, right? And now we have a who owns YouTube? Who owns or not even who owns YouTube? If I'm making any content for this, I'm contributing to a information structure that was developed by the military-industrial complex, and basically anything that I'm doing is basically making myself vulnerable to a system that either sees me as something that's going to contribute to this war machine effort, or am I going to be like challenging it as somebody who's against it? You know what I'm trying to say? And so it's not a neutral thing to ask what your position is in this kind of a situation, right? And it's not neutral at all. And it's also like, I have certain content being asked to clarify what's the point of all this. What if the point is somebody's got you feel like you're under a fucking, like somebody's pointing a gun at you all the time trying to make you do something, or that you have to conform to this really narrow version of identity, or else you're a queer, you're a weirdo, you're a mad person, you're crazy, right? And then if you're saying, well, what if I am? Like, no, nobody, like, we want those people to be the women, the black people. We don't want the straight white guys. You have your privilege. You don't get to be, so there's this, like, this is why it's like, feels crazy, is because, like, on one hand, there's this one will to keep the straight white heteronormative dude the center, but then you want to decenter him, put everybody else there instead. But then then you will also want to say that we want the people in the center to be healthy. So we don't want them to, but then what are we going to do? We have all these people that are like, don't want this to happen, that want to create we literally have white Christian nationalists who want to make the center is being white Christian settler colonialist, and everybody who looks different or has a different religion or has a different belief system is outside of that, so that we cater to our own, and that we exclude everybody else, right? And it's like, that's not how I grew up. That's not the world that I want to live in. So I'm basically don't want to do that, first of all. So in that, I can voluntarily say, yeah, sure, okay, as a white guy, I'm going to be decent, but I was never raised Christian, right? And so I feel like there's this constant pressure on me to, like, it's like you have, like, to sort of deny the actual real dynamic of my family and my community, and just conform to some fucking cliche of whatever's trendy right now, because that's what the algorithm, like think about this. If if I decided to like instead of becoming a white Christian nationalist, what if I just went to the church that I've been going to, the churches that I've been going to when I was younger that I just haven't been to in a while? You know what kind of churches those are? Those are Unitarian Universalist churches. Do you think that if I made if I chose to make a Unitarian Universalist channel versus a white boy Christian channel, which one do you think is going to be more popular? Probably not the Unitarian Universalist channel. So there's this constant pressure to deny the actual truth of who you are, your history, to conform with some stupid stereotype that other people are just trying to like stamp on you, they're trying to fit you into like you're a round peg trying to get fit into a square hole, right? And so this is why I have mixed feelings about all this, because I had some sort of hope that I could like have some kind of have some sort of whatever dialogue or communication with people, but I tend to just frustrate people because they want me to just say things that are very straightforward and to the point, but I'm criticizing that whole mentality as being, it's like the Mr. Smiths in the Matrix, basically, okay? So, I don't know. This is my honest reaction, or attempt to communicate my position, my perspective. Hopefully this cleared things up for you. Okay, thanks for watching.